President with the Asia Society Policy Institute, and I'm so glad you could join us for what I think was going to be an extremely lively and interesting discussion. We're going to be focusing on the issue of international trade and specifically how the United States can re-engage on trade with Asia-Pacific countries, with a particular focus on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. And we're going to discuss the question, should the US consider rejoining the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and in particular its successor agreement, the CPTPP. Now, the event this morning coincides with the launch of our new report from the Asia Society on re-engaging the Asia-Pacific on trade. And in this report, we look at the question in depth about whether the US should reconsider its TPP decision. As many of you recall, one of the first actions President Trump took when he entered the White House was to withdraw the United States from an agreement that it had negotiated with 11 other countries over many years. And many people expected at that point that the TPP would die a quiet death, but that didn't happen. In fact, what happened was our other trading partners, led by Japan and Australia, concluded the TPP deal without the United States. And this agreement now has been in effect among those other countries for about a year and a half. At the same time, many of the TPP provisions have found their way into Trump trade agreements with Canada, Mexico, as well as Japan. So a few words on this report. We make the case that TPP participation by the United States has become even more compelling for a number of reasons. First, our go-it-alone approach on China has kind of reached its limits, and it's time to work with like-minded countries. Second, COVID has revealed many supply chain vulnerabilities, and CPTPP provides an important mechanism for establishing trusted supply chains. In addition, the Asia-Pacific region is growing quickly. It's getting out of the economic recession, huge market. And if we don't get into this market and stay in this market, other countries will continue to conclude trade agreements without us, with the United States on the outside. And that gets me to my final point, and that is that trade agreements in the region continue without the United States, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP agreement, which has been under negotiation for about 8 years, is likely to be signed this November. So today's panel, we've got a great group to look at many of these questions. And what I'd like to do is introduce the panel and then kind of get right into a question and answer period. First, we have Ambassador Arthur Sinodinos. He is the Australian ambassador to the United States. He just joined us in February 2020. He was previously Australia's Minister for Industry, Innovation and Science, and he's held other key roles in Australia's government and parliament. Next, Ambassador Chan Heng-chi has joined us. She's ambassador at large for Singapore's foreign ministry, and she now chairs the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities, among other things. Many of us remember her fondly during her long-term tenure in the United States as Singapore's ambassador to the United States for 16 years through 2012. And I'm also proud to work with her in her capacity as co-chair of the Asia Society Board of Trustees. Next, Congressman Rick Larsen is joining us. He's in his ninth term representing the 2nd District of Washington State, north of Seattle. He serves on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committees, as well as the Armed Services Committee. And he's co-chair of the important bipartisan US-China Working Group. And this now gets me to our final panelist, former Representative Charles Bustani. And now I learned this morning that Charles actually co-chaired the US-China Working Group with Rick when he was in the House of Representatives. Congressman Bustani served in the House from 2005 to 2017, an important member of the House Ways and Means Committee, where he worked on all things trade, tax, and health. He's now at the National Bureau of Asian Research doing important work on China. Before I get to my questions, I just want the viewers to know that you can submit questions as well to the chat function on YouTube or the comment function on Facebook. And during the last portion of this program, I'd love to turn to questions from the audience. So with all of that, let me now turn to Ambassador Sinodinos. And just a question, would Australia welcome the United States back to the CPTPP? And if so, what advice would you give the United States if it was interested in rejoining? Over to you, thank you.
Thanks very much, Wendy. And can I say congratulations on the report. What I like about it is that it, not just an academic report, it actually lays out a blueprint about a possible way ahead. And in government, one of the most important things is to work out in practical terms what you can do. And I think you've identified potential options for doing this. Now, why would we, in my part of the world, be excited about the US re-entering or formally becoming part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership? I still call it that. I still haven't quite gotten used to its longer title. I have to say, because first and foremost, the US is a Pacific power. The US belongs in the region. This idea that somehow the US is separate to the region, is some sort of interloper or doesn't have a legitimate set of interests in the region because it is part of the region, is not one that I ascribe to. I think it's very important for us to put issues in that context. I think that there are, as you've alluded to in your report, major economic benefits from the US being in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. While the 11 who are in there are getting benefits from being there, the benefits would clearly be multiplied by having the US economy in there because of the size of the US economy, its dynamism, its innovation. The US remains at the forefront of technological change and advanced manufacturing, intellectual property, and the like. So the US would bring a lot in terms of economic benefits to the region. Importantly, strategically, it would be an emphatic statement about the US engagement in the region, an engagement on terms which are not just about military or security. This is about securing the living standards of people in the region. And what I would say to the American people is that the Asia Pacific remains the new center of gravity of the global economy, and that will continue to increase. There are opportunities in other parts of the world, but the Asia Pacific is where so much of the action is. And if you look at the way the middle class is growing through the region, there are tremendous opportunities for an advanced economy like the US. Now, in terms of the geostrategic competition with China, the US being in there, determining a set of rules and standards for the region, I think would be a great way to indicate to China that we are standing together with a common set of rules that if they want to play by that game, they will be more than welcome. But it has to be on mutually beneficial terms. So this is not about being anti-China. This is about being pro-growth and providing opportunities for the region. So I think the US has a great opportunity, whether it's Trump 2.0 or a Biden administration, to come back to this issue. And certainly in discussions I have with whether it's the current administration or people who potentially could influence a future administration, the TPP is near the top of the list of things that I think need to be considered. But as your report shows, Wendy, there are issues that have to be addressed if the US were to come back, because the trade landscape has changed in the period since the TPP was first negotiated. And we should take those on board. And your approach, where you identify particular areas where we could start to bring people together, is, I think, very sensible. I'll finish my initial comments there, but again, my compliments on the report. I think it provides a great way forward.
Well, thank you so much. And for the listeners, just to underscore that in our report, we do provide a blueprint, a roadmap which advocates re-entry by the United States in CPTPP, but it also just underscores it's not just a question of signing the agreement. The United States is going to need to seek updates and important revisions if it were to reconsider entry into this agreement. With that, let me turn to Ambassador Chan. You know, you're in Singapore now, and we appreciate you joining us late in your evening, but you've so many conversations with folks in Asia, and I'd just really be interested in your views. Do you think the United States would be welcome back to the CPTPP? And what would be the appetite for the United States putting new requests on the table for this agreement, particularly after, you know, we abruptly left this agreement after negotiating it for many years with countries and really forcing them to make some tough political decisions?
Thank you, Wendy, for those questions. But first of all, I would like to join Ambassador Synodinos in complimenting you for the report on the roadmap for the next administration on trade. It's very well written, it's very clear, and I think you spell out many of the pros, and particularly you highlight the difficulties. So the United States would walk back to trade, TPP or CPTPP, with eyes wide open. Now, I would say that talking to people in Asia, the members of CPTPP welcome the United States, most sincerely welcome the United States. In fact, when the United States pulled out of TPP and Japan and Australia in their leadership, pushed us, and we all came together and agreed to do CPTPP, it was a very clear understanding that the path would be open for the United States to come in. And why not? As was pointed out, the United States is a huge player. You bring economic heft. You are the largest economy in the world, the most innovative economy in the world. And most of us, many of the countries, in fact, produce goods, serve, and take your services, also produce services for the American market. So the United States is a very key player. And the United States was there at the beginning. You were one of the early members to come together with a group of countries to shape the TPP. And in fact, you led the architecture. Once you entered into the TPP discussions, you really led the discussion to set up the architecture of TPP to produce high standards and a quality TPP. CPTPP carries those standards, but we excluded some provisions. Now, the countries would like to see the United States come back, but they say not at any price. In other words, I think there's a sentiment that, we took out some provisions. We do not want to see the United States bring back TPP because TPP was negotiated in 2015. And some of the provisions may be a little outdated. And certainly, we are onto a new period. So, and countries, CPTPP countries have been working with the new provisions now. And I think they would not be so happy to suddenly just bring back the 22 provisions that were left out because the United States is joining in. And in fact, from what I understand of the United States, it often comes into a trade agreement, and every trade agreement it joins, it ups the standard. Everyone is the last agreement plus. So the conditions, the provisions are much tougher. But I think whilst countries in the region really welcome the United States, they would like the United States not to come and make very substantial demands again. Difficult demands. We all went through our legislature. We had to speak to our constituencies, persuade them to come on. We got them to TPP, then we got them to CPTPP. And now it's really, quite a big lift if you ask us to take on new conditions. But that said, I think we all want the United States in because the United States' presence in the CPTPP would make the CPTPP much more meaningful, will set the direction. And I think sometimes people wonder where it's going, but I think this will be a very clear direction. There are many countries waiting to come in, and about 4 countries have not yet ratified because of domestic conditions, domestic politics. But I think it's also because they're just waiting. If the United States is not there, what's the hurry? But if the United States comes into CPTPP, I think you will find that the countries will come back again, roaring back. And other countries that want to join will really line up and put in their applications, So, and we have Taiwan, we have that economy, we have the Philippines, we have Indonesia, we have the United Kingdom that wants to come in, and Thailand. So there are all these countries waiting to join. And the United States coming back into CPTPP will certainly give them the added push. And really, this would be the most exciting trade agreement around. And I think the United States should come back because so many things are happening in my region. Whilst the United States has pulled back to look into its domestic internal issues and the politics in the region of the Asia Pacific, many countries are signing trade agreements with each other. The European Union, for instance, has just signed, this year, I think, the trade agreement with Japan, which people say is the largest trade agreement in the world in terms of value. Then the EU has signed a trade agreement with Vietnam, has signed a trade agreement with Singapore. And that's just the European Union. So they've come in, they've become very active. Britain is very interested in coming into the region, and I think they want to join CPTPP. They have spoken to the 11 countries. They want to see how they can actually, assess to this agreement. And finally, let me just say, there is a very big agreement which is there on the table, and it is RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is 10 ASEAN countries plus 6 other countries. We call it 10 plus 3 plus 3. The plus 3 to the ASEAN 10 are China, Japan, ROK. The other 3 are Australia, New Zealand, and India. India is not signing for the time being, but the other countries, the other 10 plus 5, are on track to sign, and we hope it will be at the end of this year. And China will be a player there. China is already a very major player in the region with other initiatives. So the region is, in fact, extremely active, is bubbling. And, I've been in the United States as ambassador for 16 years. And, the United States has played a role in the growth and prosperity of the region and, creating a stable, secure peace for us. And it would be a shame at the time when we are growing and we are dynamic and moving so fast that you're missing that action. And I think it would be good for the United States to be back in the region on trade.
Well, thank you very much. Now I'm going to turn to Congressman Larson and kind of ask you, is there an appetite in the US Congress for revisiting this agreement? And particularly given your hat in this US-China working group and the attention you spend to that bilateral relationship, do you think that the TPP approach has just become more compelling and something that's really worth revisiting?
So Wendy, thanks so much for inviting me to participate. And it's good to see my good friend Charles Bustani as well. I look forward to hearing his comments. And Ambassador Chen, I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to Singapore in January of this year. We'll someday get back. And yes. And Ambassador Sinodinos, good to meet you here on Zoom. To say, I want to apologize as well. I'm in Washington D.C. I'm not apologizing for being in Washington D.C. I'm in D.C. and I have to leave the seminar or the webinar about 7 minutes early because we're actually working. I've got a committee meeting at 10 on aviation issues, and so I'll need to leave a little bit early just to get over there on time. So not to be rude, I just want to forewarn folks on that. But I do want to address your question, Wendy. First off, by saying, yes, is there an appetite in Congress right now? Truthfully, as most of the world knows, we have an election in about 34 days. And so there's the discussion around trade right now is really more of a political issue in the United States as opposed to a policy issue. And some of the questions that we're addressing through this with the report and in this webinar are really about what happens, what do we do in January? And so, and in January, we might have a different president, we might have a different U.S. Senate. I think we'll have pretty much the same House of Representatives, which changes the political calculus in Washington, D.C. about what approach to take. But I think a fundamental or foundational action that we have to take in the United States has to do more with domestic economic issues, then using that as a foundation to build the trust that we've taken action to take care of ourselves while setting the stage to go out into the world. Now, the U.S. is out in the world. We haven't retrenched. I know it may feel like it some days. We haven't retrenched from Asia, at least in the minds of many members of Congress. We'd be over there visiting if we could. We would be there visiting our partners in various countries if we could travel. But we can't, and that makes things more difficult to keep those relationships alive. But there's still a great desire here in Congress for those to keep those important relationships. But let me go back to what I said about the domestic side. It's very important in the United States that we remain as competitive as possible. So I would see the possibility of, if we were able to do a robust transportation and infrastructure bill here in the United States, where we're investing in our roads, our bridges, our highways, our ports, to ensure our competitiveness around the world. If we were investing in research and development, doing the basic research investment in our university system to partner with the private research and development, so that we are pushing the envelope on innovation here in the United States, that we are revamping our workforce training system so the workforce in the United States can maintain that flexibility that is needed in a globally competitive economy. I think you want to see those kinds of things happen, and I believe we will see those kinds of things happen as a foundation then to build upon, to go out, to continue to go out, say, into Asia and talk to various countries about trade agreements. And those trade agreements, I think we set the standard with the USMCA when the Trump administration came back with an agreement, but we were able to change it because of pressure from the House of Representatives to increase the standards, borrowing, as you noted, Wendy, borrowing many of the elements from the original TPP that the Obama administration negotiated. Again, getting to Ambassador Chan's statement about when the U.S. gets involved in these trade agreements, the standards increase. So I do think that we have to do foundational work here in the United States to answer your question about, is there a domestic political appetite for trade agreements? I still think there is. Now, look, I appreciate being on here. I'm totally the wrong guy to ask, because I am like go big or go home when it comes to trade agreements. And I'm when it comes to multilaterals as well. And I'm kind of in the minority on that. Bilaterals are important in some cases, but I think that for the United States, as big as an economy as we are, I think we are an important economy. I think we can add a lot of value to trade agreements. And that's why I think when we do multilaterals, we're in a better position. Finally, we'll say this about trade in Asia, especially, and to our good friends and allies and partners in the region, like Australia and Singapore and many others I don't want to forget, but I won't name them all. The U.S. being involved in whatever version it is, whether it's CPTPP as is, or if the US comes and says, okay, it's not all 22 provisions, maybe it's 11, maybe it's 5, maybe it's some number. But I think from a strategic point of view, the US being part of a regional trade agreement is important as a broader approach to ensuring that not just in Asia, but around the world, that we continue to press open markets, trade based on rules, and enforcing those rules. So WTO reform is part of this. But also I think it's a message to China and the Chinese leadership that the US will lead on a rules-based system where countries respect those rules, where we respect those rules in the United States, and that we aren't stepping back from a very important role that most of us do recognize that we play in the Asia Pacific region. Thanks.
Well, thank you. And Representative Bustani, let me then turn to you, and maybe you can explain to us a bit about what's going on in your party on trade. Because as a longtime trade veteran, when we used to bring these trade agreements home, we used to really count on very strong Republican support for the agreements through votes. And it just seems things are changing, and particularly when you look at recent polling, and we've included some of those polls in our report, it suggests that maybe the Republican Party is becoming more inward looking on trade, while the Democratic Party is becoming even more of a free trade party. So can you unpack that for us and maybe explain how this could impact any further movement on re-engaging in the Asia Pacific?
Wendy, there's always been an element of protectionism, isolationism in the Republican Party, but it was on the margins, it was on the fringe. And now it's moved up front and center. And this is a big concern because we've seen a lot of turnover in the House on the Republican side, where a lot of the members who were historically oriented toward free trade and international approaches have become much more inward looking, which now, in my mind, makes the case for why we need to come forward with a very compelling case for American engagement through trade. And so my good friend Rick Larson talked a little bit about the domestic politics and the need to fix a lot of the things that need to be done here domestically, and I agree with him on that. For years, we've languished in that area, but trade has to be a part of that whole package. We can't do one first and then the other. Ambassador Chan and Ambassador Sinodinos both made the comments about how active things are in Asia with the proliferation of trade deals. And if you look at this now, and if I were sitting across the table from President Trump or his senior advisors or my Republican colleagues in the House and Senate, I would say, let's look at what's happening. First off, American business, American farmers, manufacturers, American tech companies are increasingly facing a worsening outlook with regard to market access, with regard to participation on favorable terms in supply chains, and also in a defensive position with regard to setting standards. To change that, we need to get into the game. And the first way to do that is to re-engage in the most active, robust area in the world today, and that's Asia, the Asia Pacific. And we have a ready-made vehicle that we played a role in developing with TPP. And so I think your paper is brilliant in that it lays out pathways, but also lays out the difficulties that we're going to face. But that case has to be made. Secondly, with COVID, we've now seen the problems with supply chains, and the need for resilient supply chains, cooperation, and clearly getting back into TPP or some variant of that would be very, very important. Thirdly, on standards, TPP was designed to be a very high standard trade agreement for technology, digital trade, all these new issues, as well as investment and in lowering tariffs. It was going to be the gold standard. It was open architecture, so it was the right way to put pressure on China to test whether China has an appetite for reform, or China is going to continue to remain separated. It would put the Chinese leadership in the position of choosing its own self-isolation, as opposed to the US doing that by not getting engaged. Finally, I think from a security standpoint, it's critically important. American economic engagement is a very important component of our foreign policy that supplements, complements our security policy. And while we do have very strong bilateral security alliances throughout Asia, the problem we have is that it's really not supplemented fully with the economic engagement at the fullest level on standards, on setting high standards for trade and so forth. And by virtue of the fact that we pulled out, we have now put all of our Asian allies and trading partners in a position of obviously being dependent to some extent, a large extent, on the US for security, but feeling the gravitational pull of the Chinese market, where China has now emerged as their biggest destination for bilateral trade, bilateral investment, and so forth. If we don't correct that, then we cannot tell the American people that we built a comprehensive strategy for growth and prosperity and security for the 21st century. That's the compelling case that needs to be made with my isolationist and protectionist friends on the Republican side.
Representative Larson, maybe I can come back to you for a minute and just ask you about the USMCA, the new NAFTA agreement, which received overwhelming bipartisan support in Congress. And I'm wondering, do you see this as a model for future trade agreements? And I would just kind of draw the attention of our listeners that as part of the report, I went out and I interviewed a lot of current and former TPP officials, and I asked them about the USMCA and how they would feel about embracing many of the new provisions and updated provisions in the agreement. And I have to say, it was kind of a mixed response. There seemed, most respondents said, yeah, we would welcome kind of the trade liberalizing aspects, but there are certain aspects of the USMCA that, frankly, would cause problems for us. So maybe you can share with us how you view this agreement, and do you think that this is something that would help us get the needed domestic support if we were to pursue a model along the lines of the USMCA in the TPP?
Yeah, thanks. Your evaluation of your interviews is interesting, because what I hear you saying is, like, I talked to a bunch of trade people and they liked the stuff about trade liberalization, but they didn't like the things that we had to do in order to get that massive bipartisan majority to pass the bill. Well, you don't get one and not the other. You have to get both.
That's fair.
And I always say, trade is not religion. Trade is politics. It's not. It's just because David Ricardo wrote a book hundreds of years ago saying that we have comparative advantage and this is how the world works. He was a terrible, terrible political scientist. No idea how to pass trade agreements, and so we have to take into account that there's a reality to passing these trade agreements, and that's what we ran into in 2016 with TPP, and frankly, what we ran into when we passed the USMCA. What the administration negotiated was not what was passed. What was negotiated had to be changed, and it was changed in order to attract votes to so that we could pass it in a bipartisan, and very important element of this, bipartisan big majority. And some of those changes were perfectly fine from a trade liberalization and a rules standards perspective. Some were not. I know there's some grousing about rules of origin still, and we have concerns about Mexico's enforcement of the labor provisions in that. But that's why trade agreements are not just pass it and leave it on the shelf. They have to be living documents. They have to be enforceable. And so, again, getting back kind of your question, is key elements of trade agreements these days not just have to include what are the new standards, as Ambassador Chen talked about, but how are those going to be enforced, and what is the guarantee that they will be enforced? That provides comfort to create those bipartisan majorities. So whatever elements out of TPP get into USMCA, and whatever elements from USMCA that the US would use to try to, come back to CPTPP or whatever form it takes, whatever those are, you have to have enforceable standards and show, not say, but show that those standards will be enforced. That's one thing that helps create those large bipartisan majorities.
Ambassador Sinodino,
Wendy.
I can turn to you and ask you, well, first, any responses you have to the other comments by the speakers. But when Australia looks at the CPTPP and then looks at the USMCA and thinks about inviting the United States back in, what is your bandwidth for revisions and updates to the CPTPP agreement? And the other question I would just like to pose for you as well, as part of our report, we recognize that a lot of domestic work is needed before we would be in a position to participate in the CPTPP. It would take some work to work on competitiveness issues, infrastructure issues as mentioned, and really consulting widely to understand what we would want in a trade agreement. And as a result, in our paper, we propose that we don't wait, that we re-engage on a narrower set of issues or issue with the Asia Pacific and put forward the ideas of doing a more limited deal on digital trade, if Vice President Biden wins, perhaps on trade and the environment and climate, or on the whole issue of supply chains in the medical sector. So over to you, and you can respond to any part of that question you'd like to.
Well, Wendy, I think on the latter point, we recognize the politics of this. It's the same for all of us. We all have to get agreements through our parliaments. In our case, we have a treaty committee that looks at them. They look at the costs and benefits and all the rest of it. So Congressman Larson's point is well taken. You have to be able to take people with you. And this is one of the things which has changed in recent years. I think here in the US, on both sides of politics, I think there's a recognition that getting the domestic house in order is important as part of being more competitive to enter into trade agreements, and also being able to take people with you. Because one of the big concerns about trade agreements in the past is the perception that they haven't benefited the whole of the population, that parts of the country have been left behind. And that's certainly something that we recognize in the case of the US, a feeling that with globalization, parts of the US economy have been adversely affected. The real wages of some parts of the economy or some sectors have not gone up as much as in others. Mind you, in areas which engage in trade, real wages do tend to go up relative to other areas. But my point is, we take it that there has to be domestic action to improve competitiveness and to get support for trade agreements. And I think the political economy of reform is something that your report addresses. And I think also the political economy of reform dictates that, and my career has been spent in and out of economic ministries and economic jobs. And so you take reform where you can get it. I mean, this idea that there's a magic sequence of economic reforms in the economy, you start where you can get progress and you work from there. So in this case, you've identified some potential options, whether it's in the medical space, the environmental space, or the digital space, where I think quick wins are possible building on recent agreements. I think the digital space is a good one because it's a very big growing area, and it's one where I think we can get some pretty important agreements pretty quickly. Look at the work that Singapore is doing with the US, for example, in this space, the work that we've done with Singapore and others. I mean, countries in the region, I think, are on the same page. So I think your strategy of looking at this in terms of what can we get the ball rolling on, rather than waiting for the perfect outcome down the road when the economy is in some blissful state, that's going to take too long. We have to get on with it. We have to get on with the engagement. And just one final point, which was raised, I think, by Ambassador Chan about the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the idea by the end of the year that that could actually get off the ground, even if it is minus India, would be a big statement about Chinese presence and leadership in the region. And that's one of the reasons why we say to the US, whether it's Trump 2.0 or a Biden administration, please re-engage. Let's start talking. Let's find areas where we can work together. And one very final point, the more you put on the table with other countries, the more likely you're going to get them to consider revisions to the agreement. And there are provisions of the MCA, whether it's around rules of origin, say on the automotive side, which may affect the appetite of the Japanese to be involved, for example, if they're not seeing market access being promoted there. You've got to take all those sorts of issues into account.
Thanks. I have the dubious responsibility of negotiating automotive rules of origin at the end of the TPP agreement negotiations. And let's just say it was a tough slog. And you know, clearly, I think an area that would need to be revisited if we were going to rejoin, given developments over the past few years. Ambassador John, if I can ask you about the role of Congress and now the role of the executive branch. It seems to me that our trading partners kind of have always accepted that once they conclude a deal with us, even with trade promotion authority, that you know, further changes may be asked to be made. And our trading partners, they don't like it, but you know, they generally have worked with us. But now we're in a new world where the executive branch has become kind of a challenge for our trading partners in that, you know, you can work really hard with one administration, make tough political decisions, conclude a deal, only to find out the next administration may decide that it doesn't want to be part of this deal. So how does that kind of all fit in, and how do countries view the United States? How can we become a more reliable partner?
I'm glad you brought this up, Wendy, because it is concerning for many of the countries, and we want to work with the United States. We want to trade with the United States. You know, we gain a lot. There are benefits both ways. So it's a good partner. But the tendency, it seems, increasingly of the United States to change its position. It's not just the Trump administration. You know, when President Bush, you know, and I worked very well with the Bush administration. When he came in, he pulled out of Kyoto. The United States pulled out of Kyoto. So if that can happen, I think many countries are a bit puzzled that a major power, the most powerful country in the world, that it goes by rule of law, international rules, and so on, you just tear up a treaty, you walk away from a treaty. That's rather disturbing. And I think we are seeing this quite a bit. You change the rules, you ask for more, one administration comes in. So I think many countries say, I do not know when I am negotiating if this is really going to be the final offer, and will we seal the deal? Will they come back later? So you asked me, and I'm telling you that countries feel uncomfortable, you know, with this kind of negotiating style or stance. I think in the free trade agreements, the bilateral agreements, it is part of the provision that, you know, there will be regular reviews of the trade agreement, and that we understand, that will take place. But it's when you change from administration to administration, and we thought we had negotiated with the United States. It's a country, it's a government, you know. So what's happening?
Congressman Larson, if I can ask you one more question before I know you need to leave. Can you comment on Trade Promotion Authority and how do you see this authority, which is going to expire on July 1, being extended, or rejiggered, or do you think it's going to lapse? Mute. Oh, your mute button.
Muted.
Yeah.
Sorry. I'm putting you on mute between because the buzzers are going off here and the Capitol. So
Sorry.
you
I just
shouldn't
want
have
to
to.
squeeze in one more question for you, but leave when you need to.
I think, asking these questions about the future right now are a little difficult. Again, a TPA, Trade Promotion Authority extension will depend a lot upon what the trade agenda is, first off. And we don't really have a firm idea of that from either a Trump administration next year or from a Biden administration. We have general outlines. So it would depend upon the agenda itself. It also depends upon, again, the makeup of the House and the Senate. And then it would depend upon the conditions that we outlined in the Trade Promotion Authority. So the one we did, the one that expires in the coming year, within the year, it was fairly comprehensive. I think it was a good model. It provided Congress the opportunities to say, here's what we think is important. But again, every Congress is different. Even if a lot of the players are the same, every Congress is different. And so it's less of a matter of just sort of re-upping Trade Promotion Authority as is. The next Congress, which will be the 117th version of Congress, will want its own stamp on it. And again, it will depend upon what the trade agenda is and the content of TPA. And that's the best I can give. And I appreciate Ambassador's comments about U.S. Changing its positions and so on. But we do have, two parties. And as Charles noted, even this Republican administration is changing a little bit. Well, I would say a lot, but it's changing what the Republican Party, at least from the top, views, what their views are on trade. But who's to say that if Biden wins, that maybe the free traders in the Republican Party don't become ascendant again? And I would say that it's very possible that could happen if there's a Biden administration. So again, it depends upon the makeup of Congress, on the content of TPA, and on what the trade agenda is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think one thing about TPA that I learned through my career, it's a tough vote in Congress because it's largely procedural. It's a trade vote without concrete benefits, right? Because a lot of it's procedural.
Yeah, it is. And I'm sorry to interrupt. I would just say, having done 4 or 5 separate TPA votes and also being labeled as one of the TPA 28, which is not a good label to have.
In some corners it is.
In some corners it is, but when you're identified as one of 28 people, when President Obama identifies you as one of those 28 people, it's great. When everyone else identifies you that way, it's a burden to carry. So TPA votes are pretty tough, and Charles can attest to it as well, I think.
We appreciate your hard work, though. Ambassador Sinodinos, if I can ask you, how important is Trade Promotion Authority, for your government and other governments when they negotiate with us? I mean, in the TPP negotiations, it was critical at the end, and we really couldn't close the agreement until Congress passed TPA, I believe, in July, and then we concluded the deal a few months after.
Well, obviously, what happens about TPA is a matter for the American system. It's not one that we would interfere with. Looking at it from the outside, clearly, TPA provides certainty to people that a deal as a whole will be put up to be voted up or down, as opposed to, again, renegotiated, because that obviously raises uncertainties about who you're actually negotiating with. So from our point of view, it's important to have certainty around doing these deals. But to go back just briefly to a point I was making before, trade is like everything in life. The more you put on the table, the more likely you're going to get something. So while we recognize that the MCA has moved the game on, we don't discourage people from having ambition. about what is possible to do. Because I think the greater the ambition, the greater the potential benefits that can come from it. But we recognize the world has changed, and we recognize for our point of view, it is important that even if there are executive agreements done, that the Congress is fully consulted along the way. It's important that people have ownership of what's going on. And I think, if anything, the politics of the last few years has reinforced the important linkages between what we do domestically and what we do externally.
Interesting. Representative Bustani, if I can ask you to kind of change the tenor a little bit. The UK in particular has expressed strong interest in acceding to CPTPP. Of course, we're negotiating a bilateral agreement with them. Do you think if the UK were to actually enter into those negotiations, that would in any way change the equation for US consideration? Or you think it's just completely separate and we wouldn't be watching or necessarily care about that?
Yeah, it's hard to know. I think it might create some momentum for the US to take a serious look at re-engagement. But I think a compelling case can be made without the UK based on all the reasons we've been talking about. And I was particularly struck by the two ambassadors' comments about the importance of TPA, and the need to show that the US is reliable, will follow through on agreements and not walk away from agreements. One of the things I heard in 2015 while I was on the Ways and Means Committee and we traveling through the Asia Pacific prior to Trade Promotion Authority being renewed, but while we were negotiating TPP, from every single minister in all the TPP countries we visited was that you have to get Trade Promotion Authority. If you don't do it, we will not put our best deal on the table and we will not get to a final deal. But furthermore, if you look at what's happened now, where the administration is doing these partial deals, take Japan, for instance, where it was initially started as an agreement noticed under Trade Promotion Authority, but yet the administration negotiated what was going to the contours of this partial agreement without really informing Congress, and then signed it as an executive agreement. It still doesn't create the kind of certainty built into law that's going to be needed in the long run, because a future administration could come back and say, I don't like that, tear it up, and they're out. Trade Promotion Authority does two things. One, it ensures robust consultation with Congress every step of the way to ensure that broad American interests are looked after in the final negotiated product and that the votes will be there. And secondly, it creates the certainty that the agreement will have the force of law and will be lasting, rather than something that can be negated by a future administration. And I think it's going to be important in the future TPA language in that legislation to ensure that there's a process that does not allow a president to just unilaterally withdraw like was done with TPP. Congress should have say, and it should be a statutory determination that Congress should have some say before withdrawal could occur.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me then turn to the issue you raised of mini deals, because one of the recommendations in our paper in terms of going forward with a narrower deal in the Asia Pacific is that we wouldn't necessarily need congressional approval, because congressional approval, as everyone knows, can take years sometimes to achieve. And in the meantime, as we've discussed, the world is moving on. So I would just raise the point that sometimes executive agreements allow you to solve certain issues, but also to proceed on maybe a narrower course, but at least get some agreements under the belt of the United States. Ambassador Chan, maybe I can turn to you. Singapore has really been on the forefront, as mentioned earlier, in the digital trade space. You've negotiated a number of different deals with Australia, and with New Zealand,
Yes, mm.
and now I think you're negotiating with Korea even. Do you
Right.
see, if the United States were to come to you, Singapore, and to say, can we work with you and see if we can thread these deals together in some type of regional agreement? Do you think there'd be an appetite in Singapore for that?
We see the United States as a leader in this, and you have the tech companies, you have a large chunk of the business, and we're always saying, is there a global body, is there a multilateral institution that can in fact come up with the rules for digital economy? When it is not possible to get that, we go for these DEAs, the digital economy deals with different countries. So if the United States should come, I am sure we would listen very seriously and intently. But what are you actually saying to us, and who is saying to us? And what will be the content of your, what will be the substance of what you bring to us?
Thanks. And the final question, then we're going to have to wrap up to Ambassador Sinodinos. If you could, share with us your views on the potential for other accession partners to the CPTPP. Our paper notes that the UK and Thailand seem to be two countries that have been really close to the edge of announcing formal interest, but they haven't, yet crossed that line. Do you think, do you agree with what Ambassador Chan said earlier, that if the United States were to re-engage, that really opens the door for others to join, including Korea and other Southeast Asian countries?
I think the latter point is right. I think the US joining would be a big vote of confidence in the region, and it would encourage others to ratify who haven't ratified already, and encourage further people to accede. Thailand, I think, would be a good partner to look at bringing in for a variety of strategic as well as economic reasons. We're always looking for ways to upgrade our partnership with Thailand. In the case of the UK, it was a very interesting case when it first came up, and it all just looks a bit out of left field, but in the context of the UK now going for the Global Britain brand, it does make a lot of sense given the way that the Asia Pacific is developing. And of course, at the moment, the US is negotiating a free trade agreement with the UK. We are negotiating a free trade agreement with the UK. And so I think it makes a lot of sense for us to consider that, but obviously that is some way down the track. But I think certainly an emphatic statement by the US that it's getting involved would be very welcome in the region, and I think would encourage a lot of other movement. And also it would have, I think, an impact beyond the region in the sense of saying that we believe that global trade and investment can once again play its role as an engine of global growth. And that is very important as we seek to come out of the pandemic.
Well, thank you very much. And on that note, I would just really like to thank our panelists. I thought this was a great discussion. And as we all can see, there's an international component to this, but also a domestic component. The United States has a lot to work through in this area. I personally continue to believe that there are compelling reasons for the United States to revisit this decision. I urge everyone to read our new report, which is available on our website. Thanks again, everyone. And I'm sure this is the beginning of a conversation that will continue.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy. Thank you,
everybody.
Well done.